Our conference keynote speaker is Leslie Irvine from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Many of you will know her as the author of many peer-reviewed articles on animal disaster management, as well as the author of the acclaimed book, Filling the Ark. For me personally, the discovery of Leslie's book changed my perspective on many issues that intersect between natural hazard events and animal welfare systems. Her book has guided me and many others to advocate for improved animal disaster management arrangements based on evidence and our moral duty to do so. Speaking of world-leading authors, we are also blessed to have the authors of other defining books present at this conference, including Hazuki Kajiwara and Gerardo Hurtez. Other leading scholars such as Sebastian Heath, Dick Green and Annie Potts are unfortunately unable to join us this year, but send their best wishes for the conference. Professor Irvine's keynote presentation is entitled Why Animals Matter in Emergency Management. And the keynote is proudly sponsored by the New Zealand-based advocacy group Save Animals from Exploitation. But before we start, some basic housekeeping. The Zoom chat feature has been disabled, so if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature and we will endeavour to answer these questions towards the end. We encourage you to use the hashtag GADMACConf for Twitter and other social media. A short evaluation will be made available when you exit the session. And a reminder, the video recording is not available until edited and released as part of our GADMAC Awards ceremony in July. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome this year's keynote speaker, Professor Leslie Irvine.
Well, hello and welcome everyone. I'm coming to you from northern Colorado where it's and I guess that's -15 in centigrade. I'm honored and delighted to open this incredible conference. What an impressive effort by Steve and his team. I'm a sociologist by training, and my work focuses on the roles of animals in society. I'm going to talk today about two major points I made in a book I wrote called Filling the Ark, Animal Welfare and Disasters. Now, you might wonder what a sociologist is doing studying animals. Although we often think of society as a distinctly human enterprise with animals existing in their own separate world, in fact, the thing we call society wouldn't exist without non-human animals. Animals are tightly connected with us socially, economically, morally, and biologically. We don't need to be reminded of this in the middle of a pandemic caused by a virus that originated in bats, after all. For a little over 2 decades, a growing number of sociologists, myself included, have recognized the roles of animals in society and has taken this up as a topic. And you might wonder how I came to study disasters. Well, sociologists have studied disasters for over 100 years, since a graduate student studied the social impact of the Halifax explosion in 1917. When I was a newly minted PhD, I was lucky enough to land a job at the University of Colorado, which is home to the Natural Hazard Center. They do research on disasters of all kinds from many disciplines, including sociology, and I became aware of the possibilities that way. After the attacks on the United States on September 11th, 2001, everyone who's old enough to remember images has some that stood out. And for me, among those is this one here. The impact of that event on people and their pets stayed with me. And the Hazard Center has what are called quick response grants, where you apply for funding for a disaster that hasn't happened yet. So I applied in 2004 for funding to study an animal welfare provision in a disaster. And, you know, in the spirit of be careful what you wish for, Hurricane Charlie came along. The next year, I applied again, and sure enough, Hurricane Katrina struck just outside New Orleans. Off I went. Through my connections with a humane society, I did participant observation in the facility that sheltered animals rescued from the streets and homes of New Orleans. These are some of the pictures friends and I took while we were there. At the time, it was the largest animal shelter facility in the United States, if not the world. Hurricane Katrina was a game changer in terms of bringing awareness to the plight of animals in disasters. It's an understatement to say that the media coverage of abandoned pets was significant. I don't have any dramatic tales of rescue to tell you. I was mostly cleaning kennels, feeding dogs, moving dogs around, but the experience made me think deeply about how we make decisions about the treatment of animals in disasters. I thought about how we determine the worth of animals' lives and make distinctions among categories of animals. In other words, in keeping with the title of my book, who's going to be allowed into the ark? That's what I discuss in my book, and that's what I've been talking about ever since. Because animals have so many varied roles in human society, nearly any incident that affects large numbers of people is also going to affect animals. Hurricane Katrina brought attention to the plight of at least some animals in disasters. Yet, as rescuers were searching the streets of New Orleans, breaking into homes to rescue dogs, cats, birds, and other pets, millions of animals on farms nearby died also because of Katrina. Most of them were chickens. Those who didn't starve or die of thirst and exposure were bulldozed alive into skips, or what we call dumpsters. Over 8 million birds died in just one producer's facility. And when the media reported these incidents at all, the animals' deaths were reported as losses for the producers. Animals used in research received even less attention. Nobody wants to know about what goes on in laboratories, but in Louisiana State University, over 8,000 animals died in the laboratories after Katrina. Most drowned in their cages or died of suffocation, starvation, dehydration, with no chance of escape. Those who hadn't died by a week after the storm were euthanized. What media coverage there was didn't mention the loss of animals' lives, valuable data. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, it also became clear that some people suffered significantly more than others did. Some were able to leave well before the flooding began. Others had no cars, no money for gas, and no way to pay for a place to stay. Those who stayed behind, particularly the poor, particularly minorities, often waited for days on rooftops and highway overpasses for help, which in some cases never came. Photos showing New Orleans residents carrying water and other supplies were captioned in newspapers as quote unquote looting or finding food, depending on the color of the subject's skin. The idea that racism influenced the response and recovery efforts certainly wasn't news to social scientists who study disasters. We've known for a long time that various populations experience disasters differently. This is the first point I want to make. In what's known as the vulnerability paradigm, the hazard itself, the flood, the attack, doesn't cause the disaster. Rather, the disaster results from the coupling of the hazard with other factors, such as the built environment, the capacity of the population to avoid or respond to the effects of the incident. Vulnerability refers to the social mechanisms that create unequal risks. The vulnerability paradigm avoids treating disasters simply as extreme events and instead directs attention to unequal risk. The hazard sets off a social process, which ends up meaning that those with the fewest choices are the most vulnerable. This vulnerability paradigm produced numerous studies of how social inequalities shape disaster impact, response, and recovery. Now, I'll give you just one quick example. In the summer of 1995, Chicago had a record-breaking heat wave. The number of heat-related deaths eventually totaled 700. A sociologist named Eric Kleinenberg analyzed the deaths and noticed that they weren't randomly scattered, as you might expect, because heat affects everyone, but they were clustered in certain pockets of the city. So he compared two neighborhoods, one predominantly African-American and one Latino. He found high death rates among elderly African-Americans, particularly those living alone. Their fear of crime and the lack of commercial and community activity in the neighborhood forced them to stay home, often with their windows closed. Without social ties to their neighbors, they lived and died alone. Meanwhile, the ecology of the Latino neighborhood made its residents far less vulnerable. Strong social ties, relatively safe streets, active commerce, and a strong Roman Catholic Church brought people out of their homes and into contact with one another. Death rates were far lower. Kleinenberg called the heat wave an environmentally stimulated but socially organized catastrophe. Among human populations, those most vulnerable to disasters are those with the fewest choices. Other scholars have also shown how race, class, gender, and ethnicity structure people's options and choices. My research adds species to this list. Like us, non-human animals have different abilities to cope with and escape from hazards. Vulnerability is a variable characteristic. Asserting that animals are vulnerable requires asking which animals are vulnerable to what and how. Different categories of animals are differentially exposed to hazards and differentially provided with opportunities for rescue or escape. For instance, although companion animals are vulnerable to abandonment following disasters, they're less vulnerable than the animals in laboratories and industrialized farms. Animals who are locked into cages and dependent on automated systems for food, water, and ventilation are placed at great risk to numerous hazards and have no chance for escape. Because animals' vulnerability varies by the ways that humans have categorized them, we need to understand the differences in exposure and protection that animals face. These differences arise through the meanings we assign to animals. And this leads to my second takeaway. The sociologists Arnold Arluke and Clinton Sanders have said that being an animal in modern societies may be less a matter of biology than it is an issue of human culture and consciousness. Some animals are beloved family members, others are pests or vermin. We consider some wild, and whether we kill or eat them or put them in zoos depends on the meaning they have for us. Arluke and Sanders proposed thinking about this hierarchy as a sociozoologic scale, where we rank animals not by biology, but by their value to us. This is my rendering of the sociozoologic scale. In modern Western societies, we rank some animals high on the scale, almost as honorary humans. We give them emotional and moral value, while other species, we give only economic value. And we consider some animals so low on the scale that they deserve extermination by any means necessary. The position on the sociozoologic scale determines a species' moral status, which in turn influences the resources that will marshal to rescue them. But even within species, their status is flexible. For example, a pet mouse or rat would be rescued under most circumstances, but the picture would change if the mouse or rat were defined as a research animal or as a pest in someone's home. The sociozoologic scale determines that a dog in a research facility stands a far greater chance of rescue than a mouse would. The mouse would merit rescue only after first determining the viability of the data or cell lines he or she embodied. So we're going to rescue animals that we've placed high on the sociozoologic scale. Along with this, there are always interests to be served, often economic interests, but also political ones and matters of public relations. And this can result in decisions that aren't always in the best interests of animals. Here's an example. Marine disasters such as oil spills have become familiar sights. Media images of oil, birds, and wildlife are sickening, and the idea that they're being cleaned and cared for reassure the public that something positive is being done. But research on rehabilitation indicates that only about 35% of birds brought to rescue centers survive to be released, and nearly all of those released die within 10 days, even when they're deemed healthy at the time of release. The poster child of oil spills was the sea otter, following the Exxon Valdez spill in 1989. When these adorable creatures were covered with oil, it was bad enough. But when the public found out that emergency responders were euthanizing them, they went wild. And this was before email. The phones of the US Fish and Wildlife Service were jammed. So they began rehabilitating them. But the reality is that of the otters who were captured and brought to rehab facilities, many of those who were even just lightly oiled died from the stress of the rescue efforts themselves. The cost of otter rehab just from that one spill was over 18 million or $80,000 per otter. A number of otters were implanted with radio trackers before release, and only about half survived long enough to reproduce. So the effort was undertaken to appease the public and to protect the reputations of the government agencies involved, rather than to help the otters. Although I criticize some approaches to animal welfare in disasters in my work, I also offer constructive alternatives. And I don't advocate taking money away from social programs aimed at people so that we can rescue animals. My ambitions are bigger and more radical. I make the case for rethinking our uses of animals altogether. Consistent with the vulnerability approach, I want to shed light on our role in putting animals at risk and suggest ways to reduce their vulnerability. In some cases, this might mean dramatically changing or ending the use of animals to which we humans have long felt entitled. In many cases, humans can also benefit from reducing animals' vulnerability. Factory farming provides the best example. In September of 1999, two back-to-back hurricanes caused extensive flooding in North Carolina. The floods killed nearly 3 million animals. Some companion animals, but the majority by far were hogs. Most were housed on the corporate mega farms known as concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. As you probably know, in CAFOs, the animal's waste falls through slots in the floors into deep gutters or pits. CAFOs for hogs frequently store between 3 and 12 months of manure beneath the floors. A couple of times a year, they transfer the waste into outdoor lagoons. Following the second hurricane, tens of thousands of hogs drowned in CAFOs and their carcasses washed into coastal rivers. The waste lagoons overflowed, washing tons of manure into local waterways and producing a dead zone in the coastal areas and causing a massive fish kill. The environmental and public health effects are still being felt and studied today, over 2 decades later. Now, 50 years ago, a hurricane in the same region would not have caused the deaths of so many animals, nor would have had the environmental impact. So the solution to the problem of disasters in CAFOs doesn't involve making stronger waste lagoons or creating stricter building codes for CAFOs. Rather, the solution lies in questioning the practices of consumption that drives factory farming so that animals and the humans who share their environment are less vulnerable. If animals can be made less vulnerable, then people can be made less vulnerable too. In the United States, we have legislation known as the PETS Act, which ensures that a Katrina-scale disaster won't happen again. It applies to companion and assistance animals, and a lot of people have misconceptions about what the government is supposed to do in a disaster. The burden still rests with individual responsibility, but it's hard enough to get people to prepare for something that will happen, much less to prepare for something that might possibly happen. People can be encouraged to prepare through a combination of education, information, and incentives. In terms of education, just tell them to buy my book. No, really. Education involves learning about the vulnerability of the species in the region where one lives, the risks that those species might face, the risks that humans might face. Information should be provided about pet-friendly hotels, livestock transportation, housing. Make it widely available through brochures, websites, organizations. In the US, I will say this has been improving somewhat. I'm in favor of incentives, such as discounts on veterinary exams or on homeowners insurance for people who have developed disaster response plans. So to wrap up, to answer the question of why animals matter in emergency management, it has many dimensions. The answers are economic, emotional, psychological, and philosophical, and moral. I argue that once we realize how we make animals vulnerable to disasters, we can begin to question and change the practices that put them at risk and that put us at risk too. The suffering and death of animals in extraordinary events should cause us to rethink our treatment of them under ordinary circumstances. Then we can see whether they have a place on the ark. So thank you. Now let's talk.
All right, so we have the Q&A function. Thank you very much for that, Leslie. It's always very insightful, and great you touched on the socio-zoological scale. It's a key part, I think, that everyone needs to sort of come to terms with, and also the definitions of being more inclusive. And I know that Gerardo's been talking, to me for some time about a lot of the UN different definitions around vulnerability are rather human-centric. And so the inclusion of animals into those definitions, I think, is something that we all need to advocate for. We're still waiting for some questions to come in, so feel free to use the Q&A function. But I'm keen to sort of know, you mentioned about progress in the US since the PETS Act. And obviously Katrina now was some time ago. Do you think things have improved, or do you think the lack of events like Katrina have created complacency, or where do you think the overall progress has been made, and what areas do you think still needs attention from your perspective?
Well, we have had some very serious events. The PETS Act has gone a huge way to preventing the loss and abandonment of pets. We had in 2013 here in Colorado, we had very serious flooding. And they advertised, the media was saying that there were no pets lost or abandoned during the effort. The announcing places that would accommodate pets beforehand and in the early stages of the flood was very clear. And also, unlike Katrina, emergency responders were taking pets in boats in this case and in helicopters. In Katrina, emergency responders were told not to take pets, and people had, they were forced to choose between evacuating their homes or staying behind with their pets. And that's a terrible choice for anyone to have to make. So I will say that in terms of companion animals, the picture has gotten a lot better. We do have a lot more dramatic wildfires, as you know, people in Australia know well. So the issues there have to do with wildlife, which raises a whole bunch of questions that I did not address in my work. And so I would say in the United States, preparedness has been better, and emergency responders' inclusion of animals has been a lot better. But, you know, we seem to be facing newer, bigger, more frequent events around the world, really. So it's not a problem that's going to go away. I see we've got a couple of questions, so let me stop talking. How do I see? Should I read the questions aloud, or how do you want to handle this?
Yeah, if you read them aloud, the ones that you want to address, and then we'll answer them live as you go. I can click on that button. So you're welcome just to read through what questions you would like to address, and I'll manage the other side of it.
One asks, how do I see wildlife with non-threatened status fitting into the vulnerability paradigm? I see wildlife with non-threatened status as pretty low, unfortunately. The ones that are charismatic are high, and unfortunately, those who don't have, they're not cute, they're not childlike, they're not playful, they don't have frequent encounters with humans. I think they're quite low, unfortunately. I'm wondering if zoos also have been included in developing emergency plans for animals of all species, especially the role that zoos play in species breeding programs. And I think, Rebecca, are you going to help answer it? Or zoos have to, in the United States, they have to develop emergency response plans. As you might guess, it is an enormous effort. You can't just transport a giraffe or several elephants. I think zoos really have done well in the past, in several disasters lately. So I haven't done the research to be able to give you a definitive answer of how well they're doing, but at least in the United States, the zoos that are certified are required to have response plans.
And I think we've got a number of speakers throughout the conference, including Yvonne Nadler, who is a specialist in this area as well.
Fantastic.
So there's another question there about lobbying for a revised Pet Act to include commercial operations. And I think recently there was a bill passed around animal housing operations or something to that effect in the US. I don't know whether you're aware of or have any comments on that.
I don't know that there's any active lobbying going on. And by commercial operations, I'm not sure if this means dog breeding facilities or agricultural facilities. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't any legislation requiring disaster response plans for agriculture. The idea is that producers would want to protect their assets, as it were. In terms of other commercial animal facilities, there's no requirement, and I don't know of any legislation in the works. Unfortunately, I'm sure many of the participants, the attendees here, are experiencing the same thing, that in terms of research, COVID is really overshadowing a lot of efforts. And Steve, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think that it's always a case of the next disaster overshadows the previous. We've seen that with so many different sort of disasters. There's always a larger disaster that happens, and they become more frequent and more intense, and they unfortunately overshadow, especially COVID. We started the year off last year with one of the largest events, killing over a billion animals in Australia, and that would have probably continued to be the major news focus for some time. But when COVID struck, we go back to that scale you referred to, in the sense that animals sit sort of below people in some perspectives. And I wonder if that sort of drives the conversation also around sentience. Sentience is becoming more and more common in the conversation around animal welfare. And I wonder whether sentience plays a role in that hierarchy, or even in the interpretation around vulnerability. And just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it certainly does. We're especially protective, interested. We give higher social value to those animals we regard as sentient. And those we don't regard as sentient, they're going to be very low on the scale. Is that your sense too, Steve?
Yeah, I would definitely support it. And it's a matter of trying to merge a number of the different frameworks we have. We have frameworks that are used in the human space, where emergency managers are very comfortable around the understanding of vulnerability. But then we've got systems or frameworks that are used in animal welfare. And sometimes we don't bring those together in terms of the definitions and interpretations. And I think that sort of flags, if you look at probably today's participants, we've already got a converted audience. The more that we can mainstream and have an animal inclusive approach to mainstream approaches, such as reducing vulnerability and mitigation, rather than having our own specialist silos. So that's one of the challenges and observations that I meet, that typically when we have these conferences, 95% are already converted, if not more. I was going to also, oh, there we go, another great little question popping up there. How do we legally improve the PETS Act? It says OEM, Office of Emergency Management, has to have a plan. Not the plan has to have minimum requirements. So those plans can write that people will shelter in place in their home with no actual plan. This person suggesting that in New Jersey, there is no laws requiring the Office of Emergency Management to have response actions or teams. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the way the PETS Act is supposed to work is that if you don't develop a plan that includes companion and assistance animals, you're supposed to lose your eligibility for funds from FEMA. So by the letter of the law, municipalities that don't have, where their OEM doesn't have response actions or teams, they should be at risk for losing their funding. But I don't know that this has been enforced at all. So the provision is there, it just doesn't have any teeth.
A very, very good point. Often it's referred to as no carrot and no stick. So do we have any other questions for Leslie this morning? Just looking at the various chats that are going on, it's looking pretty encouraging. So what about future research? Where do you think the focus needs to be in the years to come? Obviously, there's been some fantastic research and outputs, and I've certainly seen animal disaster management becoming more of a legitimate area of research. So where do you think the gaps are? What do you think needs more work from a US or global perspective in terms of where we need to go from here?
I think, sorry, I just got a good comment or good, Kevin Dennison is out there and he said my comment about losing FEMA funding is incorrect, so I would love to be put right.
That's all right. We can probably come back to that, but it probably...
yeah.
So what we'll try to address that at sort of some stage, but that's probably again another area of research. And I think I know that when I did a research trip in Texas following Hurricane Harvey, people knew about the concepts of making sure that pets were protected, but some of the key decision makers weren't even aware of the Pets Act. And I sort of wonder whether that sort of social memory of those legislative changes has been eroded over time.
Could be. And so Kevin's answer in the Q&A was, it's a long explanation. So
it looks like we've got we've already got a presentation lined up for next year by Kevin about Pets Act, the funding, the myths and the legend. So thanks, Kevin. We look forward to an abstract next year. Sounds like you've got the finger on the pulse there, and a long explanation sounds like a good topic. I remember in New Zealand we had the Kaikoura quake, and talking about sentience, we had large numbers of abalone and crayfish that were essentially uplifted out of the water due to the quake and dry drowned. And the animal welfare legislation in New Zealand protects crayfish if they're in certain situations, such as if they're in captivity, but yet in the wild they don't have those protections. And so when you mention the different socio-zoological scales, some of those animals are sentient but don't have protections, though the laws are supposed to be acknowledging sentience. And I remember a conversation at the NACEP conference last year. There was a presentation, I can't remember his name, but it was fascinating about how fish are sentient. And I suppose our understanding of sentience is limited. And how do we advocate for improved welfare of those animals where it's debated that some species are or are not sentient?
Great question. I think it would be good to find a way to value those animals without relying on sentience, to say, look, they have a role in the environment, in the ecosystem, and it doesn't matter whether they can talk or think or whatever, they have a role there. And I didn't know about that example you mentioned with abalone, but I do think that wildlife, the response having to do with wildlife, is a key area of study. I know there's been some good research coming out of Australia, unfortunately because of the bushfires, but we need more. And of course, we apparently need more research on the effectiveness of laws like the Pets Act. But the research on wild animals, I think, would be really quite challenging to do. So someone needs to figure out how they can do that. Someone's pointing out in Superstorm Sandy, the loss of laboratory rats was considered as a loss, but sewer rats, not so much.
And that leads us on to a really good question by Steph Conroy. How can we maintain the momentum around advocating for animal welfare or the protection of a species once a specific event such as the bushfires is no longer in the mainstream media? And this sort of goes back to not deflection, but the redirection of focus from the wildfires probably to COVID.
Right, and how you keep the public's interest, I think that's where we should develop some sort of incentives to keep this on people's minds and to keep them to paying attention. For example, I get a small discount for having had no accidents in the past X number of years. Why can't I get a homeowner's discount for showing that I've developed a emergency response plan for my animals? And it doesn't have to be in people's faces all the time. It just has to be consistent enough to make sure that people are ready. People and their animals are ready.
Fantastic. And there was another question we've had from Elena, and she's wondered why failing to look after companion animals in disaster is not seen legally as animal cruelty neglect. Do you have any thoughts on that? I've got a couple of case studies I can probably throw in, but it's good to get your thoughts on that.
Well, before Katrina, the media was saying to people in New Orleans, if you leave an animal behind, you will be charged with animal neglect. But, people didn't come back for months. Some didn't come back ever. And as I said, in some circumstances, people were absolutely forced to leave their animals behind. So the question of intention, I think, is a factor there. And what are you going to say, Steve?
Oh, look, I was just going to agree. And it's also very state specific. We're talking about law. And, certainly I know in New Zealand, there's been successful prosecutions, even with, appeals being dismissed, where in particular there was a farmer in Northland who did not heed the multiple warnings to evacuate stock. The stock didn't even necessarily die, but they were put at risk, and the laws within New Zealand allowed for that person to be successfully charged for failing or for putting those animals at risk. We're quite lucky that we have Ashley Best. Ashley Best is a PhD student in law, focusing on animal disaster law in Australia. She's one of the speakers later on. And we also have a gentleman from India talking about the legislative framework in that area as well. But I think this requires, in some ways, a model law. There's still no global model law that we can compare. I know that Dick Green and the ASPCA in-care assessment was rolled out a few years ago, but we don't have anything to really measure animal disaster management. We don't have an animal disaster management index. The animal protection index or indices that are available look at many factors, but disaster management. So I think that's another area that I think globally we need to collaborate to establish some baseline standards so that we can compare and encourage the politicians to do more. Right, Leslie, do you have any final, we've got one more question, I think, and then we'll start to wrap up. But let's look at the question from Amy that's just come through. It says, do you think that social media has had an effect on pressuring emergency management planners to plan for animals? And that probably also springs another question. Why is it a now issue? 30 years ago, we wouldn't even probably be having this conversation. Has society changed?
Why is it now that we're paying attention to it? Or
yeah, we've always had companion animals. We've always had these major natural hazard events, floods, etc. Why is it so much in the spotlight now? Why is does social media play a part in that increase of profile and interest?
well, I do think, I know Hurricane Katrina was a long time ago, but I do think it was really crucial in putting the spotlight on this issue. There were, a few media celebrities like Anderson Cooper, for example, who went to New Orleans and really got good footage, good interviews, and was among the first to bring this to people's attention. Also, if you think about it, 30 years ago, even scholars who studied animals were just barely beginning to recognize cognition, emotions, and things like that. So I think it's a series of changes have contributed to why we pay attention. In terms of social media, I don't know what, if any, impact it's had on planners and responders, but I know among the public, it's had a huge impact in terms of tracking lost animals, communicating information, things like that. There have been several good studies published about initially Facebook and now Twitter and some other platforms, the way they've been used in keeping people and their animals together and spreading information about where to go and what to do.
Brilliant. And finally, do you have any words of advice for our participants and viewers today in terms of going forward and championing what we're trying to achieve through this conference?
Well, of course, let's keep up the good work. Let's keep doing, original research, and let's support one another as much as we can.
That is fantastic. Well, we'll draw to a close. On behalf of the conference committee, we'd like to thank you very much for being our inaugural keynote speaker at GADMAC. And for those that needed to have the reminder, filling the arc, I just have to get it magically appearing in front of the, I'm not having much success, but we will put a link up on our Facebook to Leslie's book. Remember, if you wanted to tweet about the conference, you can use the hashtag GADMACConf, so GADMCONF. We'll be taking a break now, and our next speaker is on in just over 2 hours' time, and it's with Gerardo Hertz, who will be talking about the Haiti 2010 post-earthquake operations for animals. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending our opening session and hearing from our keynote, Professor Leslie Irvine. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.